Gender is the thing that is assigned to your birth, but it's not just gender, it's also your caste, it's also your race, and they can decide your whole life trajectory.
All labels, to some extent, are trying to contain something that's infinite in some sort of small package, right?
When my grandmother dresses me in her sari and sends me out of the door, she knows the violence I would be subjected to. But her dressing me up is support enough, because we are never really alone if you think about it, right? We walk with the love that we have been given.
Who are you outside of who you've been told you should be? From birth, we're bombarded with messages about who we are and how we ought to behave based on gender, long before we have the ability to think about these questions for ourselves. I'm Leeza Mangaldas, and this is Love Matters. And today we're going to be talking about gender and identity with Aroh Akunth, our very special guest whose work has been focused on addressing and unpacking these topics. So Aroh, thanks so much for joining us. I want to introduce you briefly, but I'd also love for you to introduce yourself. So Aroh is a trans feminine writer, researcher, artist, one of the most articulate people I've ever had the privilege of speaking to. So I'm so excited to talk today. Aroh is also the founder of the Dalit Queer Project and the Dalit Art Archives. But Aroh, since we're talking about identity today, I really think you ought to tell us how you see Aroh.
I definitely see myself beyond identity, right? And I mean, first of all, thanks for having me and being so generous in talking about my work. But I definitely see not only myself, I hope everybody sees themselves beyond identity, right? The history of identity in the legacy that, for example, some of us would talk about identity comes from Combahee River Collective coining identity politics, right? And they were mostly like Black queer women talking about their experiences and trying to say that we don't talk about lived experiences enough and so on. That's where it is coming from. And I think, unfortunately, this is a common mistake with identity, that we tend to get focused on the
Labels.
the taxonomy, right? And I think that is a problem, because nobody has ever talked about identity, or shouldn't, without connecting it to the world, the lived world one comes from, or that rich experience. So I think for people who might be interested in knowing me, it should be enough that they can put a name to my face and know that I'm living. I think that's a good thing. That's a good way to know people. Actually, we mostly know people, when they are living, so that we share spaces with them and memories with them, And I mean, you also mentioned me as a writer, so I think, that's kind of like a posthumous honor that writers get, that we are even read even when we are not there, and you don't have to necessarily share spaces with us. But that's how I think is a good way to know and interact with me.
I love that. I think that labels, while perhaps for some can be sort of helpful in explaining and understanding oneself, they can also constrain and confine just as they define, right? I think about the identity markers that I've been attached to, or was taught that I should be attached to, such as woman, heterosexual. And I think to some extent they're like the most elaborate form of drag, Life itself is a performance, right? Like, what is gender? What is gender?
I wouldn't know. I mean, like, we know that enough people have said that it's cooked up. We know that it is so potent that it defines our life choices, the way we move, the way we see ourselves. But I'm not sure if that is a true or complete way of living, or that should be. And the thing is, unfortunately, that gender doesn't come alone, right? Like, in the very beginning, you said that gender is the thing that is assigned to your birth, but it's not just gender, it's also your caste, it's also your race, it's also a lot of times your socioeconomic background. And those are really hard things, and they interact with each other, and they can decide your whole life trajectory. And we can always say that, oh, if you work hard enough, or whatever the reasons one gives to actually obfuscate power, right? Rather than realizing that most of the people are going to be like that, that's going to dictate their whole life and so on. We tend to hyper focus on exceptions, to the rule, but not the exceptions which make us renegotiate our assumptions, exceptions which allow us to reinforce power, right? But this kind of assigning you social identities from your birth puts you at conflict with yourself from the get go. And I think a lot of thinkers are now trying to wrestle with this, like what this means.
Are there any identity markers that bring you a sense of meaning or joy? Like I see you're wearing a sari, for example, we're in Berlin. Does Indianness, for example, is that something you do like to stay defined by? I've been thinking about this for myself, and so I'm just asking you as well.
The reason I am so exhilarated by this is because I really hope people don't look at me and think Indian, because sari is not just Indian, right? Like it's also Bangladeshi, it's also Sri Lankan. I really hope they don't assign me to a nationality when they see me wearing a sari. And as for the joy in claiming certain identities, if one is using their identity to let people in and organize around it, and in some ways, identity can also be oppositional practice. Like it brings me immense joy to foreclose that my ancestors were untouchables, and that I, by the rigid systems of caste, am considered an untouchable in the South Asian context. And it allows me to build allyship and bridges with other people who have been subjected to this kind of inhumanity. My transness gives me all the logics and the right to experiment with myself and my body, gives me autonomy and empowerment, which is unprecedented without this language. At least in my journey. And I think those are important things. And as for the sari and how I get this sari, it's a friend's sari. Like I feel it's a friend's mother's sari, to be precise. When my grandmother dresses me in her sari and sends me out of the door, she knows the violence I would be subjected to. But her dressing me up in her sari and providing me that sari is support enough, because we are never really alone if you think about it, right? We walk with the love that we have been given. And similarly, this friend's mother passed away and they provided their saris to their friends who might be trans, who might not have those saris, who might not get it. Like, for example, I know many people who are not lucky enough to have grandmothers who pass down the saris to them, and so on. And it's just a way of my expression, but it's not specific to me, right? Like, in our part of the world, people have always worn saris, and it didn't matter what they had between their legs for them to have the right to wear it. It was never a question, historically speaking. So I think there is definitely joy, mobility, respect, a better aspiration for living that can be attached to identities. Yeah, but I'm not sure if identities unto themselves are a solution.
How do you think family plays into identity? When we talked before this conversation, we talked of how family, citizenship, like these things that we need can also be very stifling.
Yeah.
But what sort of relationship has your family played in shaping how you think of identity?
But need is stifling. This is quite established. Like anybody who can have an honest conversation with themselves will tell you that when you need something, you feel vulnerable. And that's not a very nice position to be in. It can make you insecure. It can make you fearful. It can make you act in a way which is not the best. I think then one needs to question, is that, yes, you need it and you might need it to survive at times. You might also be able to survive without it. There are very many people who are able to survive without it and outside it. But maybe it's not a very central idea around which you should live your life, because it's both give and take. And like As long as you know that there's a give and take, you would be in a better position to, uh, you know, reconcile yourself with that truth and complexity. But if you don't even know that it's actually a give and take, it's not just I have a need and the need is being met. When that need is being met, it is costing you something. And yeah, I hope people think more about the cost.
I think often when it comes to expressing one's gender and sexuality, particularly in the South Asian context, family can present a massive obstacle, in terms of what is sort of the respectable and honorable way to be as per your family versus perhaps who you see yourself as or wish to be. Is that something that you had to navigate? Or, I mean, as an unmarried 34-year-old woman who talks about sex on the internet, I feel like even though this is quite basic, like really not so radical, I feel like I have to navigate some of that. And I'd love to hear what your journey has been like in that regard.
Right. I think two parts to, like, I would like to answer your question in two parts. First thing is, yes, sometimes the focus on us and what we are doing, we all know this as artists and creators. Because people can't trace our original sources, because people can't trace the archives of people who have lived like us and done things like us, we just become what we become, right, in the public eye. But for example, I have known very many women, pre-independence women, working women, single women, talking about sex, because that is the generation of my grandmothers. And I have been raised by them, and I'm very proud to be raised by these grandmothers. Many of them choosing to live with friends, many of them choosing to live with their female lovers. And just because their archives are not available popularly doesn't mean they don't exist. And just because archives of similarly people like me might not be accessible, they might only know Aroh Akunth and that's what shows up, doesn't mean that that's the only reality. So I think that's one thing definitely to be careful of. And like, I feel like, yeah, given the context we are in, it's very difficult to be radical, because the demand for radicalness and what is needed for things to actually change is that much high in an unequal, brutal kind of system. You would have to remind me what the first part of your question was.
I think I was trying to get at whether family was ever an obstacle in
now I remember
navigating or expressing identity for you.
I think that's where I think we become a bit exceptionalist, because family is an obstacle all across the world. And I could tell you how respect is also tied to caste, and respect is a lot of times for children of migrants related to assimilating well and so on, right? It's tied to race. It's not just about gender and sexuality, as has been the conversation from the get-go. And the families do create obstacle, as I said, like they come with violence. So I think that's more or less answered. But I do want to talk about it in a different way, in the way that as societies, are we empowering our families to accept their children? What are we providing for these very many families? Most of the families in the world live quite poor. Make it by still, and this is just the reality. Everything from their healthcare to their education, everything that one needs to survive is up for question. There's very, very few people, even in West, even in developed countries, so as to say, who don't struggle with these things. If this is the society we have built, if this is the societies we have built, then it's but natural that on that family as a microcosm of society, there will be violence. So I think that violence doesn't surprise me. I don't have more expectation of my family than I have of the state or government and so on. But that said, it is very hard, because often in interpersonal relationships, and especially in family, which is mostly like a group dynamic, even though I have lived in a family where it was just me and my single mother, and now it's again me and my widowed grandmother. So I've lived in families of two also. But generally, it's a group dynamic. And there it can be a lot of trauma and, feeling of loss of power and being subjected to violence for the people you hold the most close to and live with. Um, and so I would reframe the thing that there are challenges and families can be obstacle, but to even be a family has a lot of obstacles, and we should not lose sight of that.
That's true. Gosh, you've made me think of so many things, but I want to bring things back to gender, since that's the focus of the episode today. I think a lot of people who are not as immersed in discourse around gender and rights and identity politics and things, the terminology is alienating. And so instead of inviting people in, the conversations end up facing some resistance, because it's just like the language only is like too much for them to consider. I mean, I think it's unfortunate people have to do the labor after being on the receiving end of the lack of that understanding already, but here we are. So can we perhaps explain to people who might be less familiar, when I asked you what is gender, I think a lot of people assume that gender is determined by what's between your legs, right? There's this conflation of biological sex with gender. And I think it might be helpful for some to understand why that isn't accurate. And also, perhaps we can talk about the socially constructed element of how we see gender. It's so omnipresent that it seems like it's natural, but it isn't.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not natural. Everything that we say is natural. See, natural is one way to support a kind of like science fiction. So whatever anybody thinks that they say is natural, they need to think like 100 times about whether it is. For example, you said biological sex, right? They are not talking about biological sex when they even say that they are talking about biological sex, because they are talking about male and female, which are again like constructed kind of sex identifications. Which means that there are, of course, like you are called male on female based on XXXY chromosomes. Now chromosomes can have variations, and there's so many intersex activists and lives and literature by and for intersex people, which talks about this. So they're talking about like a sex binary kind of, which is not scientific, it's science fiction.
Yeah, I think language truly is inadequate, and it's almost like we're playing badminton, right? Trying to talk about gender in a way that doesn't rely on jargon. Like there's all this jargon around identity and activism that actually can sometimes limit the expansiveness that is actually contained within the possibility of identity, right? Like as soon as, let's say you, in your introduction or when you Google you online and the terms associated with anybody, right? The internet reduces. So it's like trans feminine, non-binary, right? Now, most people are going to hold on to those two terms and be like, Aroh, what does that mean? What does it mean to be both trans feminine and non-binary? As if now that those two words are attached to your identity, you must somehow justify, or that's it then, or that you can either be one or the other, where even though man and woman are very reductive, that's the gender binary, etc. In fact, all labels to some extent are trying to contain something that's infinite in some sort of small package, right?
But I think labels are not trying to do that, and labels shouldn't do that, but individuals are that. And individuals should have that kind of self-respecting relationship with themselves. I think I now have gathered some of your earlier question, which was that this idea that men or women operate in any way is not consistent in any society. In any society. There are many, many what we call ethnic gender minorities in South Asia, which grow in their specific linguistic social context. We have the Nupi Manbis, we have the Tirunangais, so we have the Hijra Kothis, we have the Khwaja Saras, and so on. And yet, I think for a person like me who's passed off as trans, feminine, non-binary, whatever, I am aware of that tradition. And as of now, I'm living outside that tradition, right? And that is also means something, because there are certain kind of supports through which I'm able to live a life like this. I don't. I want to be a bit of a turncoat and say I don't have problem with the conversations we are having. I think they're great conversations, and I think activists are amazing. And I think all these people who know this jargon are also very important and essential to how the world works. I think they're on the right side of history and the right side of what needs to be done. So I wouldn't blame the jargon on those who are trying to tip the structure towards fairness.
Absolutely.
But in my observation, there are limitations to language in the way that language cannot change human apathy and indifference. It has never happened in any context. It's not happened in the context of war, genocide, hunger, poverty. Not happened. You can't talk your way out of oppression. Unfortunately, that is what the history tells us. And the other thing is, because I also take classes, I teach university students and so on, and also the communities I live in, I do work there also because it's reparative and it needs to be done. Intention is very important. Commitment is very important because it's through commitment through which you realize your self-esteem. Even people who grow up having nice self-esteems, having everything, struggle after a point to maintain it because that's the fact. We need to bide time. We all are in touch with our mortality and we must do work, and work that we are proud of, work we see ourselves in, work that makes us feel nice to build our self-esteem. And in the classroom, outside the classroom, on the road, whatever we call kindness, compassion, it's the intention that matters and committing to that intention that matters. And I think, yes, it's true that language can alienate, but that cannot be the reason for somebody to not have intentions or to not thought about those intentions. That cannot be the reason for them to be committed. Because I would any day work with a committed labor unionist who doesn't know the he, she, they of trans, but is doing good work because that work needs to be done. I would any day work with somebody who's bringing down the rents from the real estate market. Any day, we don't all have to know everything about everything. That's never been there's never been a demand, The demand has always been to reorganize and reorient.
I love that. I think so often on social media or in these like fish bowls, where unfortunately often there's a sort of sometimes discussions between people on the same team. I'm like, we're on the same team. We don't have to outwork each other, know?
Yeah.
We're on the same team.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we can do with that reminder, like if you don't quite know your way around a very anglicized vocabulary of various terms to do with gender and justice, it doesn't necessarily belie a lack of intention, especially in our part of the world where language is also something that's not, everybody doesn't have access to the same anglicized vocabulary. And it would be wonderful also if we could learn our own, as you were saying, there's a history in our part of the world also, instead of only borrowing from the language of Western feminism, right? But let's also talk a little bit about sexuality and gender in our relationships, and how sort of our lived experiences perhaps end up either throwing up challenges or even new discoveries around our own perception of and experience of gender. I'm curious whether in navigating romantic relationships, for example, do you have to explain yourself? I find myself having to explain myself to so much more than I wish I had to, I think this idea of conformity, right? And the idea of anybody who's not easy to put into a box as a misfit or someone you have to sort of like put in an extra effort to understand what they want. Like, let's say I don't want marriage and kids. Now, this seems like, why do I have to explain why that's a thing, right? But as a woman who's 34, I am constantly having to explain this to the men I am interested in dating or to my family or whatever, So I think there's elements of my gender that, or the expectations around it that factor into how the world thinks I should operate in my private life.
Yeah.
What has that been like for you?
Okay, I think this is where my response might get into the territory of annoying but this is also not knowing me, like this is how just I think and I am in my everyday. Uh, and me and my therapist constantly try to think about why, but we haven't found an answer yet. But basically, I'm gonna answer this in a social way, right? The thing is, we have to explain because we are placing a demand, right? In very of what you're saying, a woman who doesn't want to, for example, reproduce, there's unfortunately a non-conformance. And it's a cost of non-conformance that unfortunately not only women and queer people have to pay, everybody has to pay, right?
Exactly.
Like men who have shrill voices, men who have long hair in the South Asian context, men who are not probably very muscular and very, like able-bodied and so on. Men who are just outrightly not considered good looking by beauty standards and so on, right? All of them are having to pay those costs in their own ways. And before this, you talked a bit about like social media and what terms appear on internet for me and so on. And I think that's an interesting intersection of where like language and media together come together, then it's just not language, I think many of these perceptions that we are talking about are true and not true at the same time. But the thing is that so many queer people who live in India, who are my communities and so on, and I have lived majority of my life in India and so on, didn't grow up thinking trans. We grew up being called chakka, hijra, like kothi, like these were the slurs we knew. And so it would be a bit bizarre and also not real for us to say suddenly trans, because we know the names we have been called by. We know that identities also pass off as slurs, right? And I think the other thing is that on social media, if you see two people squabbling, somehow it becomes about see wokes do this, see cancel culture does this. But social media is also a reflection of a reality. It's not that before social media people were not doing this. It's not that people who don't use social media don't do this. We often do this. We are often at odds with the people who want the same thing, and that is fine because we just said that you are only doing this because you have that expectation and demand, right? It's a cost of non-conformity. It's not a bad cost to pay. It only becomes a cost because you have conformity in place. Cruising is amazing. Have you like engaged with cruising at all, Leeza?
No, I have not.
So cruising is this whole thing in queer culture where you just go and have sex with random people you don't know. You don't have to ask their names. You don't have to ask their gender. You don't have to ask whether they like to. And it happens everywhere. It happens in Berlin, it happens in Delhi, it happens in Bombay, it happens in Goa. Of course, the scenery changes. In Goa, it's the beaches. In Berlin and Delhi and Bombay, it's the parks, sometimes some cinema halls and so on. And I think that's such an exciting place, right? Because generally, if you go to, say, for example, imagine a sex club or like a high-end orgy or whatever, you have to get an invite. You have to pay an entry fee. You need to have the right partner, the right dress. But nobody's asking this of you at a public urinal, Everybody can come there. Everybody can do their business. Some people are just going to use the washroom and leave. But it's fine if somebody's having some fun in the stall, right? And that's where it is. That is the very human need to make these connections. And I think that's also a moving space, right? I've already said it's a moving space in the way of the affordability of it and who goes to these spaces, right? All kinds of people go to these spaces. Sex workers go to these spaces. Queer people go to these spaces. Queer people of all ages, races, backgrounds go to these places. Heterosexuals go to these places. Bisexuals go to these places, right? And that's where I think the most interesting things happen. Like I know so many cis heterosexual women who say that they have been raised by queer culture, which means that in these spaces, in a dive bar or in a cruising park, they learned a thing or two about sex. Like for example, I don't know, scissoring, which is more associated with lesbian. I have enjoyed it with my cis men partners also, and that's possible, you know? That's the place of possibility. And there is a certain kind of fluidity of gender there because it's act specific. It's about that particular way of interacting with that sex, which is then can also be a way of enjoying for many, can also be a way of pleasure for many, of achieving pleasure. And I think that's how I would want to answer this question, that just throw yourself into the social, throw yourself into everyday life, you know, like why would you want to hide behind a screen or an app, or like, you know, having those like, I also feel like sometimes this kind of like consent discourse gets so many things so wrong. Like, for example, there was this condom packaging with both partners could open only when they both press from both ends. You know, like I definitely wouldn't want my condom to be so protected, or like having this kind of like fully signatures and so on, and like
like a prenup.
you know, yeah, almost like a prenup.
Before,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's good to discuss those things and have a safe word and have a safe gesture if you can't use your mouth, right? Or like figuring out what safety means. That's very important. But I think that everything can have excesses, and I think these are some of the excesses which I definitely don't want in my bedroom as a person who's very vehemently pro consent and so on. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you for sharing all of that. You know, I think that the term, when we talk about gender non-conforming, we suggest that people who don't identify as such are conforming, right? Which indicates within itself the artifice of that conformity, right?
Yeah.
It's a funny us versus them type of situation where cisgendered heterosexual people tend to see queer people as the other.
Yeah.
But actually, by being on board with the term gender non-conforming, you admit that you are simply conforming, which is itself a performance, right? And yet, even people who, you know, have decided whatever, that they would at least outwardly like to be seen a certain way, etc., to the line, do try and look for outlets, like what you've said earlier, whether it's the exclusive orgy for only rich people, or whether it's a club that has a dress code, and et cetera. But what that points to, in a way, is that the respectability politics of what is, marriage and sex between a man and a woman, and missionary to have a child, and like that is not how the vast majority of people actually want to experience their private lives, right? And yet we must pretend in respectable society that the majority, are man and woman and in straight relationships and only want to have a family and want to be monogamous. And like, there's so much pretending.
Yeah. But I think that the regimes of respectability politics, and this is a good thing, have never been absolute. Everybody who does even practice respectability politics knows that they are a hypocrite. You know, they
don't like being called out, though.
I mean, yes, because they know that they are using a discourse of power, and whenever you question power, no power likes to be questioned. But when you use respectability politics logics, you can only use them in certain spaces. You can't actually govern it as of now with the technologies that we have and how we are organized as societies to actually enforce them in a totalitarian way. It's very, very difficult task. And in that sense, these so-called people who are confirming, we might say that they're performing, but actually they're not performing. They're performing terribly. I also used to dance once upon a time, and I hate uncoordinated performances. Like, that's something where I'm a conformist, right? Like, I hate uncoordinated performances. I think like all these cis heterosexuals are like a really badly organized flash mob. One hand is going there, one hand is going there. Like, nobody knows what is happening. And so all these people who call themselves confirming are not confirming. For example, heterosexuals in live-in relationships have problems accessing housing as married couples in many parts of the world. Women who appear as cis heterosexual women who appear as a bit butch do often get comments about it and so on.
Exactly.
A lot of them want threesomes, a lot of them want cuckolding and so on. Like, these are not something which the queers did and queers made happen. And I think this is where we now democratize the queer theory for your audience, that queer is not just identity, right? Like, the queer theory is coming from this idea that if you were given these 10 things to follow, even if you're saying you're cis heterosexual, you just won't be able to. So it's a myth, and I think it would be incorrect to say that most people are living like this. It would be more correct to say that more people don't talk about the conditions that they are living in. They just don't talk about this condition. So then it's very difficult to confirm to these 10 things that you have been given as a cis heterosexual, right? And I think it's interesting that you also mixed respectability with this kind of like cis heterosexual identifying, because it's not just them, right? It's also the homosexuals. It's also many other identities which try to do this kind of respectability politics. For example, 377 is read down, it becomes the big moment, right? For queer rights in India. But the reasoning for it being read down is a right to privacy judgment, which comes before that. Now, the thing is, what is privacy and who can afford privacy? Definitely, all these people who cruise cannot afford privacy. Definitely, trans sex workers can't afford privacy. And there's the thing that at the same time when 377 is read down, begging is criminalized. In that point in history, trans families are being criminalized, chosen family and so on. So as long as you are not in the purview of law, there are so many more liberties to be lived, which you can't if a very kind of regressive politics makes you their subject, which I think unfortunately has now happened for trans queer people, across the world. But historically, this has happened for women's rights, right? This has also happened for rights of workers and so on. Once you are the subject of a regressive politics, it's very difficult to come out of it. And I think that's where the respectability politics derives its power. Think of it this way: if there is no state and law to back it, it's going to be a funny opinion. Nobody's going to follow it, nobody's going to enforce it. But in India, we don't only have legal and state mechanisms, but we have community mechanisms and paralegal entities, or not even legal entities, for example, the Khap Panchayats. And in the urban cases, in the urban cities, it's the Residents Welfare Association and whatnot, which, govern our lives. This is supposed to be self governance, but it's a misleading term, to say the least.
I mean, I think in so many ways, all of the structures, right, the big structures of society, the structural principles, family, government, religion, work, capitalism, technology, all of these things kind of seek to control and surveil and sort of confine, right? And so I think that it would be wonderful if, as we sort of wrap up this conversation, if we could perhaps draw from lived experiences as well as perhaps lessons from, whatever one might have been through or studied so far, for anyone who's grappling with these types of questions around their own identity, or not able to bridge that dissonance between who they're expected to be and who they know themselves to be because of circumstance or family or whatever it is. Like, how can we perhaps attempt to be true to ourselves, while still remaining safe?
Yeah. I definitely can't tell this to people, and I definitely don't have the answer for that. I think that's a very good question. But I think there's also this tendency in our societies. Very recently, somebody was asking me, can you give me a self-help book on how to build community? I said, first of all, I don't know what books are being produced and who's producing them and like what their interests are. But there's no book possibly that is going to tell you how to build community. You just have to build community. And I think my role could be, even though very many people a lot of times reflect this to me, that whatever, something helped, like having a conversation with me helped, but I don't take the onus of those seeking themselves and make it my own. It can't be. I can only be a person they can be in conversation with and sort their thoughts out. Maybe hearing me makes them feel better and so on, right? But people who are doing this work, whether for gender or not, they're anyway doing it. And I hope they continue to do it, because that's what you need to live. And I hope a lot of your listeners are those kinds of people. That's what I hope for. And yeah, I don't think this question is something so easily answered, or definitely should be answered by somebody other than yourself. Yeah.
No, not by me. For sure not.
No, other than like
Other than oneself.
Oneself.
That no one can. Do you mean that it is not something you can prescribe?
Yeah.
One person
Yeah.
cannot really tell another person how to be.
Yeah. Freedom is not formulaic.
That's true. Freedom is not formulaic. I suppose one can perhaps share what one's own experience has been without it being prescriptive, right?
I was quite lucky. I had a lucky start. I never felt that I'm without love in my life. I never felt that life is not worth living. And when we say never, right, it's a poetic emphasis. You know, your brain obviously goes everywhere. You think obviously everything. But this is, when I say never, I mean this is the result I arrived at. And I think that was the reason was that a lot of my birth families and chosen families and communities, I do believe genuinely care about human beings, you know, be it them calling themselves, you know, left, socialist, arguing for education, healthcare, reparations, be it themselves calling themselves somebody who wants to see a world without caste or without racial stratification or without gendered lives. It's a lofty idea to live your life around, but I don't know any other idea one would want to live their life around as well.
Aroh, thanks so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and you've left me with so much to think about. Freedom is not formulaic. Thank you. Thank you so, so much. This has been such a pleasure. I am really grateful that you joined us on Love Matters.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Love Matters is produced by DW, Germany's international broadcaster, and the Indian Express. And if you have any feedback or a question for us, you can write to us at lovematters@dw.com. We'd love it if you share this podcast, rate and review it wherever you're listening. As always, I believe love matters.